The Graphic Histories Podcast.
I got bit by a radioactive bug. I tried an experimental drug. Went up for a stroll on a gamma testing range. I found an enchanted hurricane. I made a serum that made me small. I modified the serum so it would make me tall. Radioactive isotope in my eyes. Dying alien helped me accessorize. I gained the proportion and strength of a spider. Now I'm invincible and I can fly. I lost my sight, my other senses were heightened. I'm gonna put on my pajamas and go fight crime.
Hey there, and welcome to the Graphic Histories Podcast. My name is André, your podcast host. Big thanks to Uka the Mock for our theme song, Superpowers. And big thanks to you, gentle listener, for tuning in to another show. Today's guest is Paul Levitz, who is a big part of the comic industry, specifically DC Comics, for many, many years. He also went on to work for Marvel as well, but he served as an editor, as a executive, and as president of DC Comics for a period, so he was a titanic part of the industry and certainly guided comics during a seminal part of their development, certainly in my life. So it was a great chat, a great conversation, and we get into, some issues. You know, we talk about his career, his life, and walk through it, and some of the milestones he's touched on in his historic career. And I use the term live in legend not super often, but I certainly think it applies here as far as his touch in the industry and what he's done. It's been a lot. And it was a great chat. He was very gracious with his time, and I was very happy to have him on. So big thanks to him as well for coming on and having an old chinwag with André here. So, the world's getting a little crazy right now. Obviously, there's a big election going on in the States. A lot of crazy developments. You know, Biden's out, Kamala's in, Trump's normal craziness and all that sort of stuff. I don't mean to get into too many political conversations. The show, it happens sometimes. Usually because, you don't really want to offend someone if their views differ from yours. Obviously, you're trying to be as kind as possible as far as having a nice open conversation with someone, but people feel strongly about politics, and sometimes I hesitate to mention it, but generally I find like it's kind of safe because left-leaning people usually fall into the sort of artistic category usually, but it happens, and I just think it's a nice reminder with all this insanity going on in the world to remember that there's this writer, Shalom Ashlander, I think his name is. He has a book coming out called Feh. And Feh, I believe, is the Yiddish word, which means like it's all garbage or it all sucks or something like that. And he talked about early on, this podcast I listened to, he mentioned he's writing something for, I think it was the Times, it was the New Yorker maybe. And he said he didn't want his article to have comments on it. And the New Yorker said, like, well, it may not be the New Yorker, so don't yell at me if it isn't. But he said we leave the comments on. That's what we do for our readership. And then he found out like a year later, they turned them off. They found out that of the 10,000 comments that were being made, 9,500 of them were by the same like 15 to 20 people that just had an insane amount of accounts or kept spamming the comments section. So they kind of turfed it, which I think it illustrates an interesting point that we all need to remember. It's that just because it seems like a lot of people are talking about something, or a lot of people are blowing something out of proportion, or a lot of people are doing this, a lot of people are doing that. Sometimes it's just a few people that are really loud, and that's not necessarily representative of everyone, all of us as a people. So, try to keep that in mind when all this political discourse stuff comes up. I remember early on when I was doing the show, someone left a comment saying they weren't going to listen to the show anymore. It was like episode 3 or something, because I'd said something, I don't know, it was about Republicans or about Trump or who knows. But, and I just illustrated like, hey, the show is me, and this is my opinion. I sound like I talked about it for hours. It might have been a sentence or a comment here. And they took great offense to that, which is fair. And that's their prerogative to not listen to the show anymore. But it just made me realize that, like, it's kind of crazy. If somebody says one thing you don't agree with, you just shut them out. That's it. It's over. And, the only way to some kind of peace or way for us to all get along is to maybe realize that that's not the best course of action, that perhaps we should try to have a conversation instead of an argument. But, hey, I don't mean to make things political. Sometimes they are. But, we chat a little bit with Paul about this sort of thing, but not too much. It just sort of bleeds in as most chats do about these conversations. But, so why don't you listen to it instead of just me tell you about it? So, without much further ado, let's dive into my conversation with DC Comics writer, editor, executive, former president, Paul Levitz.
There you go.
Hey, Paul, how are you?
Hello, sir. Hanging in, hanging in.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Where are you calling in from?
Northern Westchester.
Oh, okay. So not too far down the line. I'm in Nova Scotia, so just above you a little bit.
It must be really beautiful up there from all that I've read over the years.
Yeah. Oh, you never made it up this way? Yeah, it's a nice spot. It's like a lot like Maine if you've ever been there. And our seasons are generally the same as New York. It's not overly colder than you guys would have it in winter. Although lately it's been getting warmer and warmer every year, it seems. So
The whole world. Did you grow up there, André?
I did, yeah, yeah. No, born and bred. I'm from a little town called Antigonish, which is kind of a
Okay.
big university town. Saint FX universities from there, which is kind of I don't know if it's globally famous, but it's certainly a big one. And I live in Truro now, which is it's right in the center. It's pretty close to the airport near Halifax area, about an hour away from there.
Okay. University towns are nice, tend to be nice.
It is. It's people. There's like a gold ring that's sort of like this with an X on it that most people would like. If you ever see one, that's from that university, and it's kind of very noticeable when you see a person walking around with one. So,
Around here, they'd most likely be taken from members of the X-Men, but
well, I've always wondered that because the school is St. Francis Xavier University. The sports team are called the X-Men. Um, and like Charles Xavier's middle name, I think, is Francis. Like it's all very connected, and like I don't know if it's how coincidental it is or how Yeah, I've always wondered if it's a very old university. Probably comes out before, like it definitely predates X-Men. So I'm curious as to exactly how that would have came to be, but
yep.
who knows? Are you from the New York area?
I mean, I'm a terminal New Yorker. I'm an old book boy, and I travel, but home has always stayed within a
Nice,
few miles.
nice, nice, nice. And was comics always a big thing for you growing up?
I love to read everything, and comics were a big part of that, and that's how I fell down the rabbit hole.
Do you remember how the first where your first ones came from? What they were?
In those days, every kid kid had a cardboard box of them in their garage, so it was the older kids' box of comics. That's the first stuff that I learned from.
Yeah. Well, I was asking specifically because I recently read your Avengers story in prep for this. So I was thinking like I read the Great Darkness and we'll get to that as well. But um I was like I want to read something that's like, probably not as I won't say well known because it definitely was a fun Avenger story, but something that's different than what your usual output was. And I really enjoyed it. And it definitely shows like a deep reverence for like the history of old Avengers, like all of the fun stuff of it, like the flirty Jan, the limitations of Thor with the hammer, everyone not knowing that Iron Man was Tony Stark, like all that stuff was really, really, really good.
Give me an excuse to go back and reread the first, whatever it was, 3 years of Marvel in order and make my little scribble notes. Oh, this is how they used to address each other. Okay, cool. I can work with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. What was the plan to create them? Always something you had with you growing up?
No, just most of the kids in New York who loved comics in my generation got a chance to be in the business for at least a few minutes. And some of us stayed, and some went on to do bigger and better things. Some vanished.
Yeah. Well, where was it where was the first getting into writing and doing that sort of thing?
I was already there, writing letter columns, text pages, working as an assistant editor. And part of what you do as an assistant editor is you rewrite scripts that need to be fixed. You do that a few times. You say, this isn't that good. I could probably do better than this. debatable, but that gives you the arrogance to give it a try.
How'd you get that initial editing job?
I was one of the first generation comic fans, so I was wandering through the halls doing my fanzine as often as I possibly could. Joe Orlando calls me in one day and asks me if I'd like to write his letter columns. Sure. A couple months later, his assistant announces he's going to take the summer off for an extended vacation. Would I like to fill in? And yeah, really complicated. And Michael Fleischer never came back, and I never left.
That's awesome. How would your folks feel about your getting into a career into comics?
Well, at that point, I was, just going up a couple of days a week and using it to pay for college the other couple of days. So they thought that was fine. A few years later, when Jenette came on board and I had a chance to go full time, and I decided to drop out, that didn't go over quite as well. But I was making decent money by that point, living on my own. Their leverage was rather limited.
Yeah. That tends, once they see that you're doing well with the money, is usually when they seem to ease the brakes on giving you hassle for a creative sort of job. I find in the history of talking to lots of other folks like yourself who kind of have a history in comics.
I'm a parent and a grandparent, and it feels really good when you see your kids succeeding in a career they like.
That's awesome. So very cool. What was the first book I guess you would have written for DC then? Coming with
I wrote some of the little mystery stories. That was the traditional way you started out in the field. Did a short Aquaman story finally, and then I think the first weighty assignment I had was taking on Phantom Stranger.
Oh wow, that's a character that I've always enjoyed. I feel like he's never got as much of a due as he deserves in the comic industry.
It was a really wonderful run by Len Wein and Jim Aparo a few years before my time. It's worth looking up.
Yeah, so then the career kind of took off, and you obviously worked with a lot of luminary people in the industry, and were responsible for hiring a lot of them. Like, were you like when it came to like the sort of British wave of writers coming over? Like, how involved? I know you're credited as being the people hiring Alan Moore and other folks like that as well.
Attention to Wikipedia. My involvement in the British invasion largely was that the very beginning, I had fanzine friends in Britain. Mm-hmm. There were guys over there who were reprinting my fanzine material in theirs periodically, so I had developed friendships with a couple. And when Joe Staten and his wife wanted to spend the summer in England, in those days she was a teacher, he was looking for a place to work as an artist during that time physically. And I was able to connect him through one of my Brit friends with Brian Boland. And that was the first of the Brits to begin working for DC, because, Joe's sending a package of art over. Maybe I can do a cover for that same comic. The heavy lifting on the Brits over the years was Jenette and Dick originally, and then Karen Berger for quite a long stretch as our British liaison. I had some role in it along the way, but much less than they did.
As far as their influence on like what they brought to the table when they came over and started working on these sort of legacy characters, like was that, as far as the editing room went, was there much shift or much involvement in allowing them a lot of creative freedom in doing that, or is this what they brought to the table and you guys recognized it's different? Let's let it fly.
Yeah, I think it really depended on the individual editing process. I think Len and then Karen on Swamp Thing were very comfortable giving Alan his head once they started seeing the quality of the material that he was doing. I think Denny, who worked with John Wagner and some of the others early on, was more prone to rein them into the approach to Batman that he believed in. Certainly their writing style comes through, but it's much less a radical departure.
Wow. And as far as like your own work as a writer as well, like, did you find it hard to to put those two worlds, like one world aside to go into the other? Like, is the editor part of your brain active while writing, or is this something you need to turn off? Well,
the editor and the writer are fairly flip sides of the same coin. So the writing job was usually the weekend job in those years. The editor job was the weekday job. So that was relatively simple. It's a little more challenging when I was continuing as a business guy and doing a little bit of writing on the side, but that was only for a few years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your work on the the Legion of Superheroes and all that stuff was, quite, like the Great Darkness saga is generally considered one of the best Legion of Superhero stories ever written. As far as like the legacy of that goes, is that something that, do you see that as your greatest work, or is that something that you don't see it the same as what everyone else does?
I don't have a vote,
Fair enough.
But if the audience has decided that that's what they like the best, then that's what they like the best, and that's why it survives. I may have a pet fondness for the origin of the Justice Society over it, but that's never been a standalone book and has been reprinted a couple times. But Great Darkness is about to be its 5th edition or something like that.
Yeah, it's consistent. I think the version I have is like probably like an 80s reprint, but I've seen so many over the years. It's a great story. Did you always have, I mean, I assume based on the work I've seen from you, you've always had a deep reverence for, Kirby and the original people, the Fourth World stuff and all of that. But approaching someone like Darkseid and bringing that character into, because was he part of the Justice, Legion of Superheroes in the future, or was this before?
He hadn't been in the Legion's time. He was connected to the mainstream DC universe a little bit by that time, but the judgment of history is that Great Darkness saga was the thing that made people care about his being in the DC universe.
Well, I can see that.
I'll take their word for it.
Well, it seemed to elevate him to a level that was more, I want to say godlike. I mean, back in the day, he was a god, but you'd see him just sitting on a couch and
supposed to be a god of evil. He should be able to do big stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I felt like in the old days they had, you'd see him hanging out somewhere like in a house or doing, you know what I mean? Like it didn't seem as he was on such a huge level. Like I remember some old book, I think it was Mr. Miracle, where he's just like sitting on a couch in someone's house and you're like, it seemed like very pedestrian for a guy of his ilk, right?
If Bob dropped by and wanted to have a conversation, I would certainly be happy to get him a Coke or, open a bottle of wine or whatever his, bring him water to turn into wine, whatever his heart's content. God and version of miracles or events you would envision.
Yeah.
But any of the above.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, you mentioned the wiki's not quite as accurate, so I won't judge all of my questions based on it. But it does credit you with bringing in certain artists and writers like John Byrne and George Perez as well. How much involvement were you involved with that?
Depends on how you judge it. Was I involved? Certainly with all of them, at least in doing contracts and things like that. Byrne, I got to work with me on the Untold Legend of the Batman miniseries that we did back in the 70s. So that was very early in his career. I got him to do the first issue. He was going to be there for all of them, but Len's challenges in getting the script done didn't fit with John's schedule ultimately. They're all, each of these is different circumstance, and there's very few artists where I can say I found them.
Oh, yeah.
We were a team, did our part.
Yeah, that's something I've always been kind of amazed with. I talked to Mike Carlin on here as well, and just the amount of like how much fun it seemed to be in some of the editing pools, working with the artists, working with the creators. Like obviously his experience, he talked a lot about the Death of Superman story and sort of all of that stuff. but the camaraderie and the sort of teamwork that comes along with it. It seems like it would have been like, I guess it takes a certain kind of person to really, I think about like that movie, the Woody Allen movie, Midnight in Paris, where it's like this golden era where all these like big people are working together in Paris, like Hemingway and Dali and all that. And then you like, it's only like that special kind of comic nerd that sort of equates that on the same level as some of these comic artists and writers working together. But I mean, for me, it does seem like that. Uh,
It's very much the same thing. At a certain point, if you're lucky, there's a critical mass of creative people.
mm,
And everybody wants to play a little bit of can you top this? Oh, I saw what he did over there. That was so cool. Maybe I could try something sort of like that, but my way. And and we were having fun. I don't think it was uniquely at DC,
mm,
but it was a very exciting time in the field of comics. And we were coming out of a long period when we thought it was a dying business. And the evolution of the comic shops gave us a new path forward and an appreciative audience. And because of what we did with things like royalties and participations, a better economic path forward for the talent.
mm.
So it was worth it for them to bet on themselves a little more heavily.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that interesting, the business side of things, especially with artist types, because artists, like in my experience anyway, and I'm sure in yours, that artist types aren't necessarily the most business minded people, because they tend to be in other worlds of fantasy more than something a little more down to earth, like when it comes to contracts and that sort of thing. How was it working with artistic types on that sort of business?
Writers and artists are generally not good business people.
It's kind of what I figured. It's almost like organizing, when you have to organize people, like as an editor would. Artistic types are like the worst to try to organize. So I figured the business side would be similar.
But writers and artists understand when they see they can't win.
Mm,
And in the 70s business model of comics,
mm,
the best you could do was really a middle class subsistence work wage, unless you were Jack Kirby and you were both the best and the fastest.
mm,
Even then, it was, the extreme upper end of middle class, but not the lower end of wealthy.
mm,
When we changed it to say, so they didn't have to be great business people to say, no one's winning.
mm,
And examples like Siegel and Schuster, who had all the problems on Superman, were kind of poster children for, well, if you can't get rich having created Superman, nothing's going to work.
mm,
When we change the rules of the game, people again say, oh, well, okay, maybe.
mm.
And of course, the other thing about being an artist or a writer, really good one anyway, is you have to really believe in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And believe that the story you have is something people will actually want to pay attention to. And if you believe in yourself enough, you believe that what you're going to do will be of lasting value. And in the economic models we were creating, if you created something of lasting value, you were creating something of lasting benefit for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting about the Siegel and Schuster conversation, because I mean, it's lately it seems, I mean, there's always been issues in the media, or at least comics media, about certain artists or writers that always feel like they never really got, like Jim Starlin mentioned a few times, he got paid more for his like cameo appearance in the Avengers movie than he made any kind of residuals for Thanos or anything like that being used in level they were. I mean, Alan Moore historically has been very upset with how his stuff has been treated in the past, not just with film, but with like, the contracts he had signed, and all that sort of thing. So it's sort of, especially now in the world with the level of comic movies, like, and how huge those are becoming. I feel like that model must be shifting constantly, like what writers or creators are expecting or hoping to get out of contracts when it comes to how their work is used in the future.
A lot of different deals out there on the planet. I'm very proud of how we treated the creators in the years I had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say nice things about how they were created. Not 100% of them, but most of them who could actually read their contracts and knew what it was that they were signing ended up happy.
That's funny. I wouldn't call him a great friend, but he was someone I'd known before he passed away. Darwin Cook used to live here in Halifax, and before he passed away, and at various comic events, just locally at the comic store that I went to and stuff, I'd hang out with him and have some conversations and stuff. And I remember we had a long talk about because I can't remember why, but we were talking about some kind of contract issue. It wasn't anything to do with him, just something that was in the news about somebody, and said like, a lot of the people that are vocal and complain the most online or in the media about this sort of stuff are the ones that didn't read their contract well enough or sign that on the dotted line or wanted that all that money up front and didn't make it a smarter choice when it comes to what's coming further down the line. And it sucks that that's how it shook out, but that's just how it is. Like, nobody forced them to sign the contract they signed, but that's what they went with.
Well, nobody forced anybody to sign any contracts ever.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah.
Comics have the challenge that the companies own and control many of the great old characters. Want to do Batman, you have to sign a contract that's acceptable to DC as well. It has to be acceptable to you, but it has to be acceptable to DC. So it's not force, but it's not an entirely open market proposition. If you've created an original graphic novel that's not based on anything that preceded it, you can sell it anywhere in the world and get the deal that you like. That's great. Some people do.
Yeah.
Some people manage to sell them too.
Yeah. It's interesting to me just because, like, not to pull out all these various examples, but just that, like, one character, like, say you take a character that's been around and then do something like Bucky and then make him the Winter Soldier, like how much that's where it gets interesting to me, because they make these billion-dollar movies around these concepts about these things, and it's like the core character was something, but the writer takes it and makes it something drastically different that's very popular, the Red Hood with DC, anything like that. And then where does it go when it becomes on that level? So
I used to use the joking example, which is a Marvel example, because that way I wasn't doing anything that was specific to DC.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't quote unquote giving away anything proprietary. Just made you the receiver of the royalties to X-Men, and you make your decision about how you're dividing it up between Stan, Jack, Len, Dave Cockrum, Chris Claremont, John Byrne, whoever the fuck else you want to throw in the pie is.
Oh yeah.
Way. Your head will explode.
Mm-hmm.
There is no entirely fair way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Any unfair ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I ain't giving anything to anybody. But when you get a Bucky story, a Winter Soldier story, there's a lot of layers to something like that.
Mm-hmm.
When it was up to Jenette or me or both of us, we did our best to be fair and come up with something that we could go to our graves feeling like we've been reasonable people. And a lot of the times we were thought of as having been fair. And I can't say that 100% of the time everybody was happy, but a lot happier than they were with some of our competition.
Yeah. And was that, like, at the time, I guess at all times, DC and Marvel have always kind of been the two biggest ones, it's the Coke and the Pepsi. So obviously when working with people that are jumping ship and going between different places and working out the best contracts for them or their lifestyle, did you find it was much of a competitive nature in that way? Like, were you guys constantly paying attention to what Marvel was doing, or is it just sort of just keeping an eye on the industry in general?
You had to pay attention to what the competitors were doing, not just Marvel, but the industries that were springing up, the opportunities for the people in other media forms. Was this writer going to go and be a film writer? Artist going to design sets for film, production design. It's always a competitive environment. You're not necessarily in bidding wars, because when someone has a Batman story to tell, they want to tell that story. Someone has a Spider-Man story they want to tell, they're going to do that where they can do Spider-Man. Darwin, to use your example, came to us with the New Frontier
Oh,
project.
really? Okay. I didn't know that was something he brought to the table. That's awesome.
But I mean, obviously, there was no place else he could take that.
Yes.
That if he'd been rejected at DC, he would have had to recreate the project entirely to make it fit the logic of Marvel for the same era, if indeed they were at all interested in it.
Mhm.
Digital business that way.
Yeah. Well, that's another interesting conversation too, is that, I mean, with a project like his, it's sort of outside of the regular continuity. It's this other story, and you kind of the sandbox is sort of wide open, I'd imagine. But it must be get into more interesting stuff when people want to work with certain characters other than other books, and it gets a little muddy that way because, you probably have to start telling people they can't use certain characters in certain ways, even though that's the plan they want to do, right?
Always interesting conversations.
It's got to be fun. Like, problem solving is always kind of a fun thing, especially when it comes to creative endeavor, like comics, I'd imagine. Like, I remember talking to Ed Brisson, who works for Marvel, and he was talking about wanting to use some character that he hadn't seen in comics in forever, but it was in some other thing, and he had to work, do these weird mental gymnastics to try to make the story he wanted to tell work with a different character and get into that. But is there much resentment, I guess, amongst creators when that happens? Like when you can't use certain people?
Great. Excuse me, if you have a great story to tell
Hmm.
and you're not allowed to tell it, you're not happy.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, so what was working with Steve Ditko like? Because he's sort of one of those monumentally mysterious characters in the comic industry for the average person. Obviously, folks that work within it like yourself probably not so much, but for us, he's kind of a mysterious person figure.
Full storyteller, and always a terrific professional and one of the most imaginative universe creators you could ask for in the process. It was a great delight to get to work with him. I think we did something between a dozen and 20 stories together.
Hmm.
Well, I lost my memory, so.
And when you went and did that Avengers book for Marvel, was that just like a one-off thing that you did because you always want to work in that world, or is it just work that came your way?
And I'd be happy to do something else for them if they're inclined at some point.
Hmm.
About 30 years of early Marvel on the shelves here.
Hmm.
I can't do the current versions of the characters for either company.
Hmm.
I haven't been able to follow it closely for the last decade. Um, so I can I could do the nostalgia version.
Hmm.
Let me be a living time machine. That I can do.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you about that if you had a reference for a certain time period, because it really seems like the work you do is sort of mired in the history of older comics. Like you did work on a book that sort of talks about the history of comics. So obviously that's a big part of your love. But where does it cap for you? Like how far back? Like what you said, modern comics not so much, but where do you draw the line? I guess.
And I mean, I stopped binding my Marvels in '89.
Hmm.
That when I decided, I wasn't likely to go over there as a writer or an editor at any point. And if there was something I would write for them some years later, they'd give me the reference to work on it. DC, I think it basically ends when I got up from the desk, and depending on how you count it, end of '09, beginning of 10. That point was just, okay, I've got enough of that. But the stuff that I love, the stuff that I care about as a reader, it's the stuff I grew up on as a kid. And once you're in the business, there's a great old Bismarck quote that I'm going to mangle slightly. No one wants to know what goes into the making of sausages or laws.
Hmm.
That's also no one wants to know what goes into the making of a creative project. When I read a comic, I'm both reading the comic and I'm remembering the writer, the artist, the challenges that went into the project. And there's almost always some stupid challenges in the process. And sometimes it's enough to say, yeah, okay, I don't really need to read this. And at a certain point, I didn't really need to read any of it, which is fine too. And, you know, the constant reinventions of the characters may be a sound business approach, may not be. I'm not going to support it or argue against it. It's their turn to figure out how to make things work. But it makes it less appealing to me as an old fart. And since I have never been paying for the comics, they're not losing anything by my not buying them.
Fair enough. And I'm 38. I'll be 39 very soon, and it's frustrating to me. It's hard to keep, like, I guess for a comic fan, of my ilk, I love continuity. Like, I love keeping track of the stories, and I'm not saying I'm like a crazy hound for it. It doesn't bother me if they change something or whatever. But like, it's tough to keep up with that model that let's, like, every 5 years we're going to blow up the universe and start it over again. It's because then you try to explain to some casual person what's going on with Superman. You're like, well, he's from the previous universe. There was a different one, but he died and he took over. You know what I mean? It just gets, and he had a son, but then the son's older, but then there's another guy from another, like the flat. Yeah, exactly.
The world, welcome to it. I hope
But
it's working.
yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like, I wonder. I mean, obviously, I assume the New 52 was such a when they did that one, it was probably such a big thing that it makes you wonder how often they're going to keep redoing it before they try something else. It was certainly as a casual fan, it is very tough to keep up with it. Cool. Well, what was like? Tell me about a bit about your work with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. Obviously, you're passionate about, like you mentioned, helping creators get deals that you can feel good about. So obviously, carrying that over to that was probably important. So I'm just curious about that.
Canada is not immune to some of the same forces that the U.S. suffers from a little. We suffer from it a little bit more.
Hmm.
Historically, periodically, the American population decides to blame every new medium on their social problems.
Hmm.
Rock and roll is corrupting the youth of America. Grand Theft Auto is going to teach every child to be a criminal.
Hmm.
Comic books have to be burned because they're creating juvenile delinquency. And comics have had real challenges to the creative people. Banned books, some of the greatest works that have been done in comics in the last couple of decades have been banned all over the place in the South of America. The fund was started because of problems that comic shop owners were having with overzealous cops who were seizing on some particular work that might be in a comic shop and deciding that everything in it was obscene and trying to shut the shop down or arrest the owner in some fashion. But it expanded its work to try to deal with all of these different kinds of situations. In one southern state, forget which one, a couple of library clerks at one library decided that League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was satanic. And
I do you know what was their exact reasoning? I'm just curious. Okay. The mental gymnastics required to figure that out would be amazing to me.
I will give them the benefit of the doubt that this was an entirely sincere belief on their part.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Their answer to this was to avoid restocking it on the shelf and to keep hiding it away so that nobody could get it in circulation.
Ugh.
That was against the rules of the library because the library believed in circulation of its titles. And they were fired. They called on their pastor. They began a large protest of all of this to try to get public opinion behind them, prove how evil these comics were. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, among other things, found a professor who was an expert on Victorian fiction, who knew the origins of all of the characters and could tie it to Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and everybody else whose work was being assimilated by Allen in it. and get that professor there to testify, to explain the cultural value of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and how it fit that tradition and had nothing to do with being satanic, despite having, I think, a vampire in it, which was the most overtly satanic thing about it.
It's so ridiculous. The hills people are willing to die on. It's a monstrous. That's amazing.
You
Wow.
know, a lot of times, having dealt with many different people about comics over the years,
Mm-hmm.
you have people who have passion for what comics were when they were kids,
Mm-hmm.
and they remember what they view as the safe stuff, and they want to share that with their children. And I we did a Green Lantern story based on Matthew Shepard. You remember the Matthew Shepard case, the young man who was basically crucified for being gay.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a father calling up and reaching me through the switchboard and saying, I love Green Lantern. I want to share the comics with my child, but I can't if you're going to do stories like this. And I had to say to this man was clearly sincere in the torment he was going through.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, look, I support in every way your right and your responsibility for determining what your child reads.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't want him to read about this, you probably shouldn't have him reading our comics, because we're going to depict the full diversity of the human race if we can. We're empowering our writers and artists to do that. We think that's the right thing to do.
That makes me happy. Well, that's another question I was going to ask you, was what kind of tightrope it was like walking, with allowing creative freedom to your writers, but also, you are a business, so you're trying to make things that are digestible by the public as well, or will sell. So, it's always interesting about that tightrope that you have to watch with mainstream media.
I don't think we were in the creative freedom business. I think we were in the creativity business.
Mm.
Fine art has true creative freedom. The artist creates what they want. After the fact, it's made available to the public for purchase or not. Comics have an editorial process, have editorial controls in it. There's a desire to be creative. You use the term sandbox, which I've used from time to time. There's a fairly expansive sandbox to play in, particularly if you look at the DC universe over here, the Vertigo material over here, the Milestone material over there, whatever. The different portions of the sandbox that we had by the 90s. But we had defined rules for each sandbox, and you could choose to play in them or not.
Well, that conversation with that gentleman, to me, I always find that interesting, and I often have been quoted recently as saying, a lot of the issues we have as a society, and Canada's not free of them. Believe me, we have our own problems too. Is that a lot of people are very interested in things that have nothing to do with them. If it's a book that I get, that gentleman obviously had a reference for Green Lantern, so that he took that one personally. But it's like, if it's not for you, or you don't want your kid to go to a drag queen reading a story at a library, don't bring them. To me, it's like, it just seems like people have a lot of opinions. They could just say it's not for me and move on with their lives. But it's more about making everyone see things the way they see things is where the problems come. And comics is full of that sort of stuff, I find. Especially, online is full of trolls or people that are passionate about one thing, or get upset when they make a character black instead of white in a movie. Dumb, arbitrary stuff that they get very passionate and angry about. It's like, if it's not for you, just don't watch it. Don't support it. Go read the comics you love, or watch the cartoons you love, and maybe don't subscribe to the new version that you don't agree with.
There's a balance in all of this.
Mm.
I'm in favor of a tolerant culture. I'm in favor of a tolerant legal system.
Mm.
And I think as long as people aren't hurting other people, they should be allowed to do what they want. I certainly understand the battle over what can be in a school. Should a 6-year-old child be able to dial up pornography
Yeah.
on a school?
Yeah, I agree.
I feel uncomfortable with that.
Hmm.
I'm not sure my definition of pornography matches your definition of pornography.
Mhm.
Sure as hell, it doesn't match the definition of pornography of every one of my neighbors in the community in which I live. Potter Stewart may have been sure that you know it when you see it.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the famous quote, which I always found. Yeah.
Sometimes the boundary is not exactly that clear.
Mm.
And we live in such an interconnected universe now. And the controls, when I was 6, there was no possible way I could access pornography for simplicity's sake.
Hmm.
There was no local store that sold it. Obviously, there was no internet.
Hmm.
Even assuming that I'd been a particularly energetic 6-year-old, nearest theater that showed X-rated movies was probably an hour by public transportation and a couple of fares away. So you had to be of a certain age, a certain level of independence before you could access things. That's not true anymore. That must make the job of being a parent more challenging. However you want to draw the line on what kids should be aware of and not. I don't know what age I understood what homosexuality was, but it was probably well into adolescence. I certainly didn't know the sexual orientation of some of my close friends in high school or college years, because everyone was closeted if they weren't heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my children, my grandchildren are growing up in a world where they understand all of that from an age before they really understand what sex is.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my youngest son years ago being grilled by his older siblings about the music teacher, announcing that the music teacher was gay, and they're asking, you know what that means? He says, well, it means he likes other boys. Okay, close enough for probably a 6-year-old at that time.
Yeah.
It's a more complicated world. It's a better world, at least in most of modern America, in that more people are free to live the lives they choose that aren't hurting other people,
Mm-hmm.
openly and in a healthy fashion. But I think it's a shock to the senses of a lot of people who are desperately trying to claw the world back to the 1950s.
Yeah, there are some ones that are running for political office, for sure.
The degree of public conflict in America, right?
Hmm. Well, it seems like the levels of, I mean, I guess getting into a broader conversation, but the levels of, it seems like there was a time period where, like, if you didn't necessarily weren't on the same political side, you could agree on certain things that were for the good of everybody. Now it seems like even if you could say, look, here's a bill that's going to cure cancer, it seems like the other side will vote against it just because you want it. In a lot of cases. That's a very extreme example, but there are ones that just seem like it's just they want it, so it's not good, regardless of whatever it is.
Got some of that problem in America, certainly. But they have gotten a few things done in the last few years. The infrastructure bill and the amount of money that was spent on that,
Mm-hmm.
current administration, some of the work done in the previous administration on things like Project Warp Speed was absolutely vital to our survival and the ramp up of the plague.
Mm-hmm.
And that was done on a fairly bipartisan basis ultimately.
Yeah, it bothers me because like it's happens in our system here too, but that it's like it takes something extreme like that to happen before you can find any kind of any kind of common ground. Like I'm not sure if you saw that film that just came out, Civil War, the one that Alex Garland directed. And I mean, it depicts a modern day civil war in America, but the way that the writer made it or the director was it could kind of happen anywhere. They're very vague on what side is what, and it's not really about party, just about the reality of what it looks like in a modern day world for that to happen. And in a way, you kind of watch these seas of bodies being chucked into pits, and you kind of are like people dehumanize each other to a level sometimes that it's like you forget that we're all people, that they're just human beings, and it's it's scary.
We are all human beings. It's one of the sentiments that flowed through my Legion work.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether or not they were actually human beings or not.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Right on. Well, do you have any? I mean, I know you're retired now, so retired life is treating you well.
Completely retired. I'm doing a lot of teaching these days, little bits of writing projects here and there,
Mm-hmm.
consulting, little bits of board work.
Nice.
Not
What do you?
not working as hard as I did in the years gone past, certainly, but still keep pretty busy.
Do you have anything coming up that you want to talk about, or just
New edition of Great Darkness coming out next month.
that's awesome?
If you don't have it on your shelf, go rush out and buy it.
Awesome. Do like when it comes to do you find it easier or when it comes to revisiting those projects? Do you have a lot of hand putting in together these new editions that come out? No.
Sometimes they ask me if I've got, some old script material or something on the shelf that would be cool to put in, or sometimes they ask me to write an introduction to some volume. But for the most part, the editors know what they're doing. They put it together just fine.
Nice. You must, as someone who lived in that world, it must be nice when you watch the editors, doing their gig and doing it well, and just saying, well, they got it.
I edited enough reprints in my time. Some I thought I edited really well. Some I wish I was a little older and wiser when I did. So it's
Nice.
just their turn.
Nice. Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Pleasure. Thank
I
you,
really
sir.
appreciate it. No problem. Have a great day. There you have it, my conversation with Paul Levitz. A great chat. I really enjoyed it. A lot of information, a lot of insight into one hell of a career, and one that certainly shaped comics for years to come. There's one part of the conversation I didn't get a chance to ask him about, and I always wondered how it would have went. So maybe I'll get a chance some other time. I don't want to reveal that in case I ever get a chance to talk to Paul again. I certainly would like to keep that in my pocket for then. But there's a part of his career in one particular event that I'm aware of that I think would be interesting to chat with him about again, and maybe we'll get that opportunity sometime, but maybe not. Either way, I'm quite happy with that conversation, and big thanks to Paul for being on the show. Be sure to tune in next week. I do and can announce who that guest is. His name is Jeff Haas. He has his own podcast, interview style, very similar to mine, called Traversing the Stars, and he also is a sort of a promotional manager for other talent as well, so obviously kind of my radar when he had people that he wanted to have on the show. And I had a great kind of chat with him as well. Very cool guy. A lot of inside baseball as we kind of talk about the process of doing shows like this, because the first time I kind of got a chance to chat with someone who does the same thing. And it was a really cool talk. He has a lot of interesting careers and a lot of interesting stories, so I was very happy to have him on, and you can listen to that next week. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Be sure to tune into our sister podcast, X-Rated, the X-Men Anime Review Show. And make sure to tell a friend. Your smoke signal, carrier pigeon. Get the word out, help get this show in as many ears as possible. It would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you in a week's time. But before then, be safe, have fun, and read some comics, goddammit. Graphic Histories Podcast is a proud partner of the United Federation of Podcasts.